Way geekier. Today we talk about Glorious Purpose. Season 2 of Disney's Loki miniseries just ended and fans are absolutely loving this show. After following the character from the Thor movies as a villain to one of the most loved heroes in the MCU, the character journey we have all just witnessed is absolutely phenomenal. But let's take a look back at some of the key moments of Season 2 and what's next in store for the God of Mischief. This is an obvious spoiler warning for anyone who hasn't seen Season 2 of Loki yet, but I advise you to go and see it because this show is absolutely phenomenal. Season 2 of Loki kicked off by following the events of Season 1, the finale when Sylvie killed He Who Remains. So at the end of Season 1, Loki ended up back at the TVA, but when he approached Mobius in B-15, they had no idea who he was. So there have been fun theories coming over the past 2 years with many suggestions on what might be going on in this scene which we saw at the end of Season 1. Some people believed that after killing He Who Remains, Sylvie ended up rewriting history and the timeline, and a new Kang variant popped up which took control of the TVA. In true Marvel fashion, the truth ended up being way more convoluted than anyone expected. So after coming through that time door which Sylvie pushed him through in the Season 1 finale, Loki started to time slip, and so he kept going from one point in time to another randomly. So when he met his friends in that scene, he was actually in a TVA of the past where he had not even been pruned or come to the TVA yet as a variant. This new ability of Loki, it wasn't really explained much in the second season, but based on what we saw, it had kind of something to do with He Who Remains. Loki's time slipping, it's kind of fixed early in Season 2 when Mobius is forced to use a device made by Ouroboros to forcefully pull Loki out of the timeline and back into the TVA. So speaking of this character Ouroboros, I didn't expect to like this character as much as I did, given the fact that we were just introduced to this guy in Season 2. OB was set up as this awkward recluse character who lived under the TVA, like in the basement, and he wrote the TVA handbook which everyone uses, and he's been there since the inception of the TVA, but in the end, this guy turned out to be one of the best characters we saw in Season 2. His dry, deadpan humor, he had hilarious reactions to everything, and it made him a unique perspective on everything that was happening in Season 2 of Loki. Another character who really captured my heart in this season was Victor Timely. He is a variant of He Who Remains, and it shows that, not all kinds are actually evil. When Loki and Mobius were chasing down Ravonna Renslayer and Miss Minutes, they ended up in 19th century America. They were going after a guy who was supposedly destined to end up becoming He Who Remains in the future. That is this guy, Victor Timely. So Renslayer and Miss Minutes were trying to make him the new He Who Remains to take control of the TVA, while Loki and Mobius wanted Victor Timely to help them fix the timeline at the TVA. So for most of Season 2, we were told that this Victor Timely guy was the variant of Kang that was destined to become He Who Remains. But by the end of Season 2, no one is entirely sure if that is actually the case. Well, personally, I do believe that this Victor Timely is the variant that ends up becoming He Who Remains, because when Renslayer and Miss Minutes came to that specific timeline to give him the TVA handbook, that timeline in which Victor Timely is listed as the sacred timeline. And we know that this sacred timeline is the timeline which is preserved by He Who Remains, because it is the timeline that leads to him winning the multiversal war and then creating the TVA. The reason I'm still not 100% convinced that Victor Timely and He Who Remains are the same person is because in the finale of Season 2, when Loki and He Who Remains are speaking, he ends up mocking Victor Timely's speech impediment, and then he refers to him as he instead of I. Like when he was speaking to Loki, he was like, that is what he told you. Like that's what Victor Timely told you. Instead of saying like, that's what I told you. When Loki was referring to the whole Loom expansion plan and how it's failed, and then how Victor Timely said that was a scaling problem. But then again, He Who Remains has lived for so many years, for eons, and he exists at the end of time. So it's possible that he was Victor Timely at some point in the timeline, but it's been so long since those days that he doesn't really identify with that part of himself anymore. So earlier in the video, we mentioned that Loki was time slipping to different points in the timeline. By the end of episode 5, he found a way to control this ability by focusing on specific people at different points in time, enabling him to slip back to different points in time to try and stop the loom from overloading and exploding and pruning all the other timelines. So after so many tries, Loki basically gave up on trying to fix the loom, so then he went back to the season 1 finale where Sylvie killed He Who Remains, and then he went to confront him directly and ask him why he didn't stop Sylvie from killing him, and this brought about probably my favorite moment of this whole season of Loki. So He Who Remains took his tempad and he tapped it, and immediately Sylvie was frozen in time, and he was even able to make her disappear to give him and Loki time to talk, which made me scream because in the back of my mind I always knew that this guy let Sylvie kill him because there was no way it was that easy to take out someone who was as powerful as He Who Remains. So when he froze her, this guy was basically saying to us, the whole audience, that, if I wanted to stop this, at any point I easily could have stopped this, but I let it happen because it needs to happen. So it's also here that we discover that Loki, aside from being able to control his time slipping, he also has the ability to freeze time just like He Who Remains, which surprises He Who Remains. So this moment is played off like a funny conversation in which Loki and He Who Remains come to an understanding that no matter what happens, no matter what Loki tries, unless Loki kills Sylvie, she would end up killing He Who Remains, the loom will overload, it will explode, and then Victor Timely will end up becoming He Who Remains. He will create the TVA again, and the cycle of rebirth will continue forever. So up until this point, there's always been a sense that He Who Remains was fully in control of the narrative, like everything that was going on. And when he asked Loki how many times he has even tried to stop Sylvie from killing him, it was basically confirmed that, this guy is in control of the whole narrative of everything that is going on. However, during their conversation, the writers used a brilliant foreshadowing metaphor to show what Loki's final decision was going to be. So when He Who Remains mentioned that the only way to save the timeline from multiversal war was to kill Sylvie or let the loom overload and explode, Loki quoted a line from a poem by T.S. Eliot, a poem called Little Gidding, in which he said, "We die with the dying, we are born with the dead." So He Who Remains' reaction here, it seems like a little throwaway funny gag or something, but I think it was way more significant than most people realize. So up until this point, He Who Remains knows exactly what is going to happen. He even has a script of what everyone is going to say. We saw that at the end of season 1. So why was he surprised or confused by what Loki said here? I think this is because at this point, Loki had decided to do something which He Who Remains did not anticipate for him to do. I think according to He Who Remains' plan, Loki was supposed to end up deciding to kill Sylvie and let He Who Remains rule the timeline. But once Loki decided to try something different, He Who Remains has no idea what is happening and he stopped being in control. So at the point when they were speaking here, Loki was an equal with He Who Remains. He had full mastery over time, and he was actually even more powerful than He Who Remains because, unlike He Who Remains, Loki does not need a tempad to travel through time and space. He can do it by himself. He was a superior to He Who Remains at this point. He Who Remains mentioned to Loki that the only reason the multiverse is even safe is because he has decided to be alone at the end of time, sitting on his big chair, overlooking the timeline. And I think this is the very moment which Loki decided what he had to do. He had to destroy the loom and try something different. So up until this point, Loki was trying his best to do everything. He wanted to save the timelines, he wanted to save the TVA, he wanted to save his friends, he wanted to find a way to be with them at the end of everything, but that was never going to be possible. There was always something that Loki would have to give up to save the timelines. So He Who Remains revealed to Loki that the loom actually never failed. It was actually designed to prune all the other timelines and leave only the sacred timeline if it ever overloads, as a failsafe. So Loki had to destroy this loom and try something different if all the timelines were to exist as, he and Sylvie wanted it to be. So this is when we see Loki complete probably the greatest character arc in the whole MCU, maybe outside Tony Stark at the end of Endgame. He has literally gone from the god of lies, who was created or destined to bring people together by his addiction to failure, to the literal god of time, someone who controls all the timelines, taking on the mantle as the new He Who Remains, being forever alone outside of time and keeping the multiverse alive by feeding his energy to all the timelines, and he ended up doing the opposite of what He Who Remains had decided to do. So the final shot we got of Loki destroying the loom and then ascending the stairs to become the new god of time, literally transcending our reality to become a fourth dimensional being who is capable of wielding time and creating the world tree with his own hands, is easily one of the most stunning and incredible shots Marvel has ever decided to put on screen. So much so that I almost wish that this was in the cinema and not on Disney+. So after all this happens, Loki is finally alone at the end of time, overseeing the multiverse as the god of stories. Finally, Loki has got his throne, but finally Loki is all alone, sacrificing himself and his desire not to be alone to ensure that his friends and all their timelines stay alive and safe. By the end of season 2 of Loki, the TVA is completely different from what we saw at the start of the Loki series. So the TVA doesn't go around pruning timelines anymore. Instead, they are more like the caretakers of the timelines, and they go around hunting all the variants of He Who Remains and taking care of all of them. And we also see that on these new TVA monitors, we don't see the sacred timeline anymore, but instead we see the world tree which has been created by Loki, which is allowing the multiple timelines to grow and intertwine together, all of which is overseen by Loki and the TVA to make sure that this multiversal war never starts. Also, during this finale, they mentioned a Kang variant that has popped up in a universe adjacent to the Earth 616 universe, and then we are told that this Kang variant was taken care of. We know that this 616 universe is the main MCU timeline, or basically the sacred timeline. They are basically the same, in which the show has taken place so far. So this Kang which they are talking about is probably the one we saw in Ant-Man 3, which Scott Lang and the gang defeated in the quantum realm. After the finale aired, we also got an interview with Tom Hiddleston on the Late Night Show with Jimmy Fallon. And in this interview, he seemed to suggest that, this was the end of Loki and that he was bowing out of playing the role. I will admit that this is probably the most incredible end to Loki as one of the MCU's most beloved characters. But let's be real, we all know that this is not the end of Loki. So before season 2 even aired, we got confirmation from some Marvel sources that they plan to reunite Loki and Thor at some point in the future. So maybe what Tom was talking about here was this being maybe the end of the Loki series as a standalone property, because we fully expect Loki to come back at some point, with a new Avengers film coming out somewhere in the next 3 to 4 years. Remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Also, share this video to anyone who you think might be interested in a topic like this. You've been listening to Way Geekier, and we'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.